Welcome to Being Human with your host, Steve Cuss. Really glad to be with you today. Many of you have been following along on this show for months or even years when I had the old podcast. What we're all about is helping us to notice and name and diffuse reactivity in us and between our relationships so that we can be connected to ourselves, connected to our precious relationships, our friends and family, but also connected to our enemies as Jesus commands us to do, so that we can get past the things that block healthy human relationships and connect with each other. And then fundamentally, to connect to awareness of God. It's crazy how easy reactivity kicks us off awareness of God. And most of my work is with Christian leaders and pastors. And oftentimes we're the last in the room to know when we're not well. And that's what reactivity does, is it tends to get you on a treadmill to nowhere and you don't even realize you're reactive. So on this show, whether it's guests or solo episodes, we help you notice, name, and diffuse reactivity. And one of the hallmarks of the show is we light a candle every time we're together, which for those of you joining me just on Audible is always funny. But lighting a candle just helps us remember the Lord. So as we light it today, two simple invitations. The first one is there something that you're carrying or something that has a hold of you that's carrying you that you know that God is inviting you to trust God with? Is there something you're anxious about right now? Are you ruminating on a problem and you try to worry your way to peace? But as I light the candle, this is an invitation for you to give it to God. The very thing that you know that you can't change by worrying about, maybe God's inviting you to hand that over. So question number one is, what are you carrying that God's inviting you to give to God? Question number two is very similar. Is there something you need from God? Is there something you want to ask God? I know for me as a faith leader, I struggle to ask God for things, partly because I'm afraid of being let down. So if I never ask, then I'm never let down. I'm not proud of that, but that's one of my areas of growth. Also, partly because I'm focused on others. I tend to pray for others. I'm uncomfortable praying for myself, and that's not healthy either. So, what do you need to give to God? What do you need to receive from God? I'm going to light the candle in silence to give you a chance to make that exchange with God, and just warn you that my new lighter is a newfangled USB lighter, so you won't hear a click, you'll more hear a sizzle. Here we go. Just that time of quiet for you to make an exchange with God. One of the things reactivity does is it tries to get us to carry more than God has asked us to carry. So just a chance to take a breath, light a candle, and remember that we're human-sized, which is all God's ever asked us to be. Okay, on today's episode, I'm excited about this. We're going to explore the dynamic of three different things. We're going to explore playfulness, earnestness, and worship. Playfulness and earnestness. When I do organizational consulting, oftentimes I'll come in to an organization, I'll spend a day or two with their whole team, sometimes just with their executive team. And one of the things I'm looking for, and those of us who have been trained in systems theory that we're looking for, is the level of earnestness in an organization and the level of playfulness. These are opposites. It's almost like you could picture an earnestness to playfulness spectrum. Now, I don't measure it with like a survey or anything like that. It's pretty subjective. But what we're looking for is some common traits. If an organization or a person is overly earnest, then one thing is they're easily offended. People get easily triggered in a team that is too earnest. The second thing is the humor in the team, if there's any humor at all. In an earnest team, the humor is got a little edge to it. And so what that does is it shows people with a safety radar, I cannot be myself in this place because I might get hit by the humor. Now, what's interesting is playful teams have humor as well, but it feels different. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. If you walk into a room I don't know if you're like me, I'm quite intuitive to walk into a space and kind of pick up the mood of the team. But it doesn't take long to figure out, is this humor aimed at someone or is everyone laughing together? But an overly earnest person or an overly earnest team gets easily offended. They have humor that has a knife edge to it. But then the easiest thing to notice is rigid thinking. People stuck in earnestness tend to get stuck in the same thinking patterns. They struggle to use their imagination. They keep trying harder and doing more of the same as they approach a problem. So the final thing really we're looking for when we look at earnestness in an organization is dichotomous thinking, kind of all or nothing, black and white. Either way, it's very rigid. And if they're approaching a problem, they don't have the imagination to think, outside the box, as you would call it. And also earnestness, this may sound weird to you, but it blocks intimacy in a team. There's not a high level of safety and trust and care. The team is more about performance than trust in the team. That's earnestness. But one of the great gifts that any leader can bring to a team, and if you're a parent, this is a great gift you can bring into your family, is playfulness. The opposite of earnestness is playfulness. Now, when you first think of playfulness, of course, you think about goofing around. And yeah, that's definitely a piece of it. But what proper playfulness does with humans is it opens up possibility. We're no longer locked in with our head down. We're now able to see. We are able to hear other people's ideas without getting as triggered by them, so as to open up more connection. Playfulness brings tremendous relief, and it builds intimacy and trust. When I was a lead pastor and we would host our staff meetings, I tried to bring playfulness to every meeting I ever led. Years ago, I read Patrick Lencioni's amazing book. I don't know if you've heard of this book, but it's called Death by Meeting. What a great title. We have all been in meetings where we're like, I would rather be dead than in this meeting. And in the book, Lencioni makes this crazy claim. He says, I think a well-run meeting should be more fun than going to a movie. So Pat Lencioni's goal was to create a meeting structure where people would rather come to your meeting than go to watch a movie. Now, if that sounds crazy to you, I really took this to heart. And one of the things Lencioni teaches us to do in our meetings, he says, manage the energy as much as you manage the content. A lot of people, they come into a meeting and they just focus on the agenda. But what we do in our reactivity training when I come into organizations is I teach them how to notice not just the agenda, what we're doing, but the context, the way we're doing it. And so I took Lencioni's challenge seriously. I started bringing a lot of fun to the meetings. I'm a youngest in the birth order, so playfulness comes naturally to me. As a youngest, I'm kind of naturally irresponsible. And so every staff meeting, I would give away prizes. And typically the prizes would be gift cards or something like that. But there were seasons where our church was on like a spending freeze, just tight seasons that every church goes through. And we couldn't spend money on gift cards for people. And so I would go to the local supermarket and the produce aisle, and I would buy a romaine lettuce and a bell pepper and a single jalapeno, and I would give those away as prizes. And typically what we would do in our context is we would celebrate where we'd noticed God working that week or between meetings, and we would celebrate a staff member, and then we would give them a prize. And, just playfulness. I'm famous, or perhaps infamous, for coming into organizations. When I do my anxiety work for organizations, I bring a suitcase of prizes with me. And it's interesting, of those of you watching on video, I've got some of them behind me. I give away a heat-activated Fred Rogers coffee mug that when you put coffee in the Fred Rogers mug, his suit turns into a cardigan with the heat. These goofy prizes, just fun, playful things, because playfulness, it helps people get a little taste of relief. It helps people move from disconnection and combativeness with each other and offense to deep connection and care and love. Now, when you think of playfulness, you think of like a child. That's exactly right. That's what I have in mind as well. Let's talk about playfulness in our faith and playfulness in our life as individuals. When you watch a kid play or when you watch a group of kids play, the play is the ends, not the means, right? Like us adults, we get so earnest. I find in my life, I'm always in a hurry to get more done. It's really hard for me to stop and play. But when you look at a kid like a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, and if they invite you to play, the play is the point. It's not like the ends to something greater. Now, I understand in brain science, I get it, that kids are playing and their synapses are developing healthy rhythms and so on. But what's really going on for that kid is the whole point of play is play. They have fun for fun's sake. It is intentionally inefficient. Play is intentionally unproductive. So if you're in a workplace environment where everything's a bit serious and people are pretty offended with each other, one of the systemic problems that might be going on is it's too earnest. Your whole system, your whole team is stuck in earnestness. And your attempted solutions are more of the same and try harder. Maybe you or the leader could inject some playfulness, some laughter, some celebration, some intentional, unstructured time that is intentionally inefficient, where what you do in that time is unproductive. It's for its own sake. A few years ago during the pandemic, our executive pastor at our church, Tom Morris, who's just a wonderfully playful guy. And you might say, really? Executive pastor and playful? Yeah, man, he was such a gift to us. Being a church staff through COVID was really tough. And so for one staff meeting, he did all this work ahead of time. And do you remember, I think it was in the 90s, maybe it was the 2000s, the old computer game, the Oregon Trail. You know, I'm an immigrant from Australia, so I don't know much about it, but it was a big thing in America. Tom set up where we could all go into teams and play the Oregon Trail together during our staff meeting. And then he had several of his team go around and take our lunch orders and then pick up lunch and deliver them to our houses. We were all remote at the time. It was basically a staff retreat where we played the Oregon Trail and we got our lunch catered and delivered to our house. It was just playful. There really wasn't a mission benefit to playing the Oregon Trail. But playfulness, boy, did we need it during COVID. Okay, so the hallmark distinction of playfulness, it's inefficient. It's intentionally inefficient. It's intentionally unproductive. It's its own ends. My dear friend Nancy Ortberg, she says that when you are playing, you lose track of time. You feel like a kid again. I think this is probably why grandparents love being grandparents, because they don't have to raise these kids. They get to just play with them. I used to work with a lady, and she was a younger grandparent, like her kids were really young. And as they would get older, you know, mom and dad would drop them at her house for the day or for a half day, and she would greet these kids at the door. And the first thing she said is, "Welcome to grandma's house, where every day is Christmas, and the answer to every question is yes." I love that. That's a playful grandparent. That's somebody that those kids can't wait to be around. Okay, I've got a dog, and my dog is 4, and I've probably talked about him on this show before. My dog is such a gift to me. But Brody, my dog, he makes me play. Just last night, you know, we take him out twice a day. We're actually very good at giving our dog a lot of exercise, but still, it'll get to be 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and we're kind of ready for bed, and Brody's like, "Oh no, it's playtime." And he will find a toy and drop it on my feet, making me play with him just for the joy of play and connection. Okay, great. So playfulness and earnestness. You're like, okay, I get it. So just before we move kind of the next stage of this, maybe you just want to pause and ask yourself a reflective question. Am I too earnest right now? I know for me, my default, I mean, I'm a playful person, but if I don't work on it, my default posture is more work, more productivity, more improvement. That's the path I naturally set for myself. So I have to interrupt my momentum with playfulness. Maybe you do too. Have you been playful lately? How might you inject playfulness into your system or your community? Maybe it's your workplace, maybe it's your home place, maybe it's your friend group. And I understand for some of you, you might be rightly saying, look, if you knew my work environment, you wouldn't be quite so pithy about this. It's very difficult to inject playfulness in my work environment. Let me just say two things. First of all, I understand that if you're not the key leader, it's more difficult. If you're a middle manager or an employee or something, it's difficult. But can we just talk for a minute about if maybe you're thinking to yourself, well, my work is so serious. Like the mission of what we do is so important. Who has time for playfulness? Can I remind you that I used to be a trauma and hospice chaplain? Like my job was to help people die and to help families navigate a loved one's death. My job was to help people navigate the news of cancer. These truly life and death situations. I mean, it doesn't get more serious than death in a family. Therefore, all the more reason to appropriately inject playfulness into the system. Now, of course, I'm not inappropriately bringing playfulness into a grieving family. Of course not. But I am to the staff, to the doctors and nurses. I am with my fellow chaplains. And then, sometimes, not in the moment of acute grief, but there was often times where one of the tools on my chaplain tool belt when I'm working with families was playfulness, joy, great laughter. Not that it takes their situation away, but that it gives them just a little moment of relief, just a little breather. And we all need that. We all need that. One of the things I'm proudest of in my life is that I work with organizations, some of which do some of the most grinding, difficult ministry in the world. I'm talking organizations that work with children in grinding global poverty. I'm talking about organizations that help people in foster care and anti-sex slavery and things like that. And I'm so proud to say that those teams doing those very difficult work bring playfulness into their team. That's how they survive. So before we get into how it relates to our faith, just a time for you to reflect, what's my level of playfulness right now? Even now as I'm listening, can I pause this podcast and just do 2 or 3 minutes of play? At the end here, I'm actually going to give you a tool on how to do that. Let's talk about earnestness and playfulness in our faith. Earlier, in one of our earlier episodes, I read one of my all-time favorite quotes by G.K. Chesterton. I'll just give you a little taste of it now, where he said, "For we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we." I'm so provoked by that quote. We have sinned, and our sin is making us old, and our Father, Chesterton is indicating, is a playful God. And so that makes me curious about your relationship and my relationship between earnestness, playfulness, and worship. If earnestness is over seriousness, then I think sometimes we can get in trouble in our faith by taking it, hear me here, but hear me carefully, by taking our faith too seriously. We're so, how would you say it? We're so earnest about getting it just right that we miss the heart of our Father. And maybe introducing and injecting a little playfulness into our faith might be just what our faith needs to get us out of rigid thinking, dichotomous, locked-in thinking, more of the same and try harder attempted solutions in our faith. And what I've been fascinated by lately is the relationship of playfulness and worship. They both exist for their own end. Worship is its own end. It is not a means to another end. Worship is, by definition, unproductive and frankly inefficient. Worship is not really about improvement or mission. It's simply about enjoying the presence of God and noticing, this is the harder side of worship, noticing that God enjoys our presence. So how can you inject playfulness into your worship today and this week? And as we keep thinking about this, can play actually itself be a form of worship? I know most of us don't do this now, but it wasn't that long ago, the 80s and 90s, where we tended to lock in our faith to what we famously or infamously called the morning quiet time, prayer and Bible reading. Now, just in case you're worried about where I'm going, I try to read my Bible every day. I don't read my Bible every day, but probably 5 days a week I'm in my scriptures. I try to pray every day. I don't pray every day. So I'm not dismissing the traditional quiet time. I'm not dismissing the power of Bible reading and prayer in our life. What I'm introducing to us is a way of engaging God and worshiping that adds to the palette of our worship and engagement. And it doesn't just keep it in some of those more earnest things, because sometimes what can happen in our Bible reading is we can miss the heart of God by reading our Bible too earnestly, trying too hard to get meaning out of the Bible rather than using it to worship God, trying too hard to make sure we've prayed for everything rather than letting prayer be our just enjoyment of God and as powerfully God's enjoyment of us. So one of the tools that I've been teaching now for, by golly, 6 or 8 years is called the life-giving list. And there's a link in the show notes. You can just click that link and you can download a free life-giving list. It's just a very simple spreadsheet. The life-giving list is an intentional document of worship playfulness. It is the gifts that God has given you that you can't give away to someone else. Most of my work is with Christian leaders. We are prone to give away too much. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux says, do not be more generous than God. Don't be more generous than God. He's talking to Christian leaders. And so I created a life-giving list to encourage leaders to enjoy the gifts that God has given them rather than give all those gifts away. So you can click the link, you can download the life-giving list, and you'll see when you open it up that it's simply 6 very simple columns. 3 of the columns are the people and the places and the activities that God has given you that make you feel human and alive. What are the people, the places, and the activities that God has given you? And then the other 3 columns kind of relate to those. So there's a column for the people. Just make a list of all the people in your life that God has given you who are a gift to you. And then the next column is, are they remote or local? Some of your precious people are in town, some are out of town. That comes really in handy when it's time to budget time and money to be around your life-giving people, right? Next column is activities. What are the activities that God has given you that are a gift from God because you are God's beloved child and because you're a human? And then the next column is how much money and time does that activity take? So as you're making an activities list, I encourage you to take little micro activities that take 30 seconds to 3 or 4 minutes, as well as activities that take money or time. So micro activities for me, one of them on my list is rubbing my dog's floppy ears. Several times a day, I rub my dog's ears. Holding my wife's hand is on my life-giving list. The first time I see or hear from my children every day is on my life-giving list. These are these little micro things. But then macro things, like I love to spend a day on a trout stream with some good friends here in Colorado. Well, that takes all day. That's a longer thing, or of course, like a road trip. You get the idea. Activities that take just a couple of minutes to sometimes several days. Now, before we get to the places, let me just pause and say what I'm doing when I'm with these people, when I'm doing these activities, or when I'm in these places, is I am intentionally letting those things trigger my worship of God. So when I rub my dog's floppy ears, I'm actually giving thanks to God for this dog. We got our dog Brody during COVID, and he was such a gift as a little puppy while we were all in lockdown. And so when Brody comes up to me, and by the way, my dog demands his floppy ears being rubbed. When he comes up for an ear rub, I'm not just rubbing his ears. I'm saying, Lord, thank you so much that you gave our family this dog. What a good God you are to give us this dog. What a gift he's been to our family. Just a little prayer of thanks. It takes not even a minute. And just that moment helps me relax into the presence of God. Of course, another activity on my list is lighting a candle, which we do every time in the podcast. An activity on my list is reading a chapter of the New Testament every day. You see the point. The third category is places. And just like activities where we want to do micro activities and big activities, with places, we want you to capture places around your house as well as places you have to drive to. And so then the final column is distance from home. So our kitchen countertop is a life-giving place in my life. So much laughter, so much connection with my wife and my kids and our friends. The last time the kitchen counter was a place of rich connection was last night. We had some life-giving friends over. We shared a long, slow dessert together. And then we just there was no agenda that evening. We just enjoyed each other's company, these life-giving people around this life-giving place. And as I was looking at them and seeing the laughter and the connection, I just took a moment to say, God, you've given us these people, how good you are to us. So if you download a life-giving list, I'm going to encourage you to spend the next 30 days seeing if you can trip over the love of God. Go on a hunt for the love of God. What people has God put in your life? What places has God put in your life? What activities has God given you? And then what I try to do is I try to cultivate 12 to 15 micro habits a day where I'm tripping over God's love 12 to 15 times a day. I don't always do it, but that's my goal. And I'm also trying to calendar time. So it's not just like micro things for the day, but I'm also using my calendar as a worship document. Because what I notice in my faith, particularly in Western culture, is how obsessed I am with spiritual growth. I'm so obsessed with spiritual growth that sometimes in my well-meaning effort to grow and improve my relationship with God, I miss the heart of God. Does that make sense? I'm so earnest about growing in my faith that I actually miss God. The spiritual disciplines were not designed to help us become better people. The spiritual disciplines are all designed to help us encounter the risen Christ in worship. And yet, because I'm a Westerner, I tend to co-opt everything into control. That's just what us people in the West do. And so I tend to take these gifts from God and I twist them into a well-meaning spiritual improvement exercise. So just a couple of things. I want to let you know, I'll actually be doing a whole episode on this, but I have a book coming out May 28th called The Expectation Gap, and it manages the gap between what we believe about God versus what we experience from God. I believe God loves me, but I struggle to feel it. I believe God's with me, but I struggle to see it. I thought I'd be further along in my faith by now. I tackle these three core gaps. And, kind of what we've been talking about today is some of what we get into in this book. How do we enjoy the God we believe in? How do we relax into God's presence when we're too earnest? And the book comes out at the end of May, but you can pre-order it on Amazon or wherever you like to order your books. You can do that now, and I'll put a link in the show notes to that as well. But I want to provoke you with a question. So we're going to wrap this episode with a question, and then I'm going to close with a quote from a systems theorist named Ed Friedman. First of all, here's the question, and the question relates to earnestness, playfulness, and worship. If you and I were playing a game right now of Would You Rather, you know that game where somebody gives you two diabolical choices and you can only choose one? Okay, here's my Would You Rather game. Remember, you can only choose one. Do you think God would rather your spiritual improvement or your worship? Do you think God would rather that you improve as a Christian or that you worship God more? What would God rather have? If God was forced to choose, what would it be? And your answer probably says a lot about earnestness versus playfulness for you. Okay, let's wrap up today with a quote from the wonderful, provocative Ed Friedman. In this quote, he doesn't use the phrase earnestness, he uses the phrase seriousness. Same idea. Here we go. Friedman says, seriousness is a way of thinking embedded in constant chronic anxiety. It's characterized by a lack of flexibility in response, a narrow repertoire of approaches, persistent efforts to try harder, an inability to change direction, and a loss of perspective. The antidote to seriousness is the capacity to be playful, which is not to be equated with making jokes. This notion of playfulness has less to do with one-liners than with the concept of flexible distance. Playfulness can get you out of a rut more successfully than seriousness. That's a selection of edited quotes from Ed Friedman from his book, Generation to Generation. All right, friends, how can you be playful today? What is God calling you to enjoy today and this week? I just invite you to have that engagement with God, and we look forward to seeing you next time.